Welcome back to Final Witness. A quiet home in Surrey, a family torn apart. Years later, new testimony reopens a case that once seemed closed. This is the story of Dawn Rhodes, her son, and the man who was tried twice for the same crime. Her husband, Robert Rhodes. It was June 2nd, 2016. Police were called to a semi-detached house in Redhill, Surrey. A 999 call had been placed by a child. When officers arrived, they found Dawn Rhodes seriously injured. She later died. Her husband, Robert Rhodes, said he had acted in self-defense. He claimed Dawn had attacked him and their child with a knife during an argument. At first, the case followed a familiar path. There was a criminal investigation. There were medical examinations, witness statements, and an initial trial. In 2017, a jury at the Old Bailey returned a not guilty verdict, accepting that the assault could have been an act of self-defense. For many, the case looked closed. But this story did not end in the courtroom in 2017. Over the next years, the picture quietly shifted. The couple's child, who had been central to the original account, disclosed new information while receiving therapy. The child, only a primary school-aged child at the time of the incident, told a therapist years later that the original story had been coached and that the truth was far darker. The new account was shocking. The child said their father had planned the attack, had pulled the child into the plan, and had manipulated the child to give a false account. According to that later testimony, the child was instructed to support the cover story that Dawn had attacked the family, not the other way around. Because of that disclosure, the Crown applied to the Court of Appeal to quash the original acquittal and allow a retrial under the double jeopardy provisions, an exception that permits a new trial when compelling new evidence emerges. In late 2024, the Court of Appeal granted the application and the case returned to court. The retrial began at the Inner London Crown Court. Prosecutors presented a composite case. They argued that Dawn Rhodes had been murdered by her husband, that the original self-defense story had been manufactured, and that the child had been coerced to support the false narrative and to take part in the staged injuries. Evidence presented at the retrial included the child's later recorded disclosures to medical and mental health professionals, accounts of the physical injuries found at the scene, and testimony about the behavior and statements of the defendant in the immediate aftermath. Jurors also heard about the family's background. The marriage had broken down. Divorce proceedings had been started. Prosecutors told the court there had been long-term coercion and manipulation. The defense argued that what happened was a tragic, unpredictable escalation of a domestic argument, and that the defendant had acted in the belief that he or his child was in danger. One of the most disturbing elements of the prosecution's case was the allegation that Rhodes inflicted wounds on himself and on his child to bolster a self-defense claim. The prosecution said those wounds were not consistent with a spontaneous struggle, but with deliberate attempts to construct a story. During the retrial, the jury was reminded of an important legal principle. The child gave evidence that could not be presented in the original trial. The Court of Appeal had decided that the new disclosure was reliable and sufficiently compelling to justify setting aside the earlier acquittal. After hearing weeks of testimony and carefully considering the evidence, the jury returned its verdict. On December 12, 2025, Robert Rhodes was found guilty of the murder of Dawn Rhodes. He was also convicted of criminal offenses related to perverting the course of justice, perjury, and child cruelty for the role the child had been forced into. Sentencing was set for a later date. In court, family members expressed relief that the case had come to this conclusion, but also deep sorrow for all that had been lost. Most of all, Dawn. This case raises hard questions about evidence, witness vulnerability, and the limits of the justice system. It shows how traumatic memories, especially those of children, can be suppressed, reshaped, or concealed under pressure, and how long it can take for the full truth to surface. It also illustrates a rare legal path. Courts do not lightly allow retrials after acquittals. The double jeopardy rule exists to protect the innocent, to uphold finality, and to prevent abuse of the state's power. The exception that permits reopening a case requires fresh and compelling evidence that was not available at the time of the original trial. In this instance, the new evidence was the child's disclosure to a therapist in 2021, followed by subsequent interviews that corroborated elements of that disclosure. Those later statements formed the backbone of the Crown's case at the retrial. Forensic experts and medical witnesses provided context for the injuries seen at the scene. Psychological specialists gave evidence about the effects of grooming, coercive control, and the ways abusers may manipulate victims, including children, into silence or complicity. Family members, neighbors, and professionals who had contact with the family were also called. Some described a relationship that had become strained and volatile. Others recalled the aftermath of that night in 2016. A house in shock, emergency services attending, and a community left with questions. The child's testimony, delivered in a sensitive setting and supported by trained professionals, was understandably harrowing. The court took special measures to protect the child's identity, and reporting restrictions ensure the child cannot be identified in public accounts. Beyond the headline verdict, this case has broader implications. It is a reminder that criminal investigations and prosecutions can evolve, particularly in crimes involving vulnerable witnesses. Advances in understanding trauma, improvements in how children are interviewed, and cooperation between mental health services and police can all lead to new evidence coming to light. The family's loss is profound. Dawn's loved ones have said she was a devoted mother and that her memory will endure. They have also spoken about the complex feelings that follow: relief at accountability, anger at the years of denial, and the continuing pain of her absence. What can other families and viewers take away from this case? First, that no verdict is always final in the moral sense. The legal system provides routes to revisit cases where credible new evidence appears. Second, that professionals working with children and trauma survivors need to remain vigilant. Sometimes disclosures made in therapeutic settings are the key that unlocks a stalled investigation. This story also prompts reflection about how communities respond to domestic abuse. Many victims live with fear, manipulation, and shame. Supporting them and ensuring there are safe channels for disclosure is a public priority. For now, the legal process continues to its final stages. Sentencing will address the penalties the court considers appropriate in light of the convictions. Appeals remain a possible next step, but the retrial's verdict has already rewritten the official record of what happened that night in Redhill. If you or someone you know is affected by the issues in this episode, domestic abuse, coercive control, or child exploitation, there are specialist charities and helplines that can help. Please check trusted national resources and local services for support. Thank you for watching Final Witness. If you found this episode informative, please like and subscribe.